More than 25 years after a teenage girl vanished on her way home from a night out, one of Britain's most haunting cold cases has finally been closed. UK authorities have confirmed that Steve Wright, the convicted serial killer known as the Suffolk Strangler, has pleaded guilty to the 1999 murder of Victoria Hall, who was just 17 years old at the time of her death. Victoria disappeared in September 1999 after leaving a nightclub in Suffolk. Her body was later discovered in a remote rural area. Despite extensive investigations, arrests, and public appeals, her killer remained unidentified for decades, turning her case into one of the UK's most painful unsolved murders. Steve Wright was later convicted in 2008 of murdering 5 women in Ipswich and sentenced to whole life imprisonment. At the time, investigators suspected he may have been responsible for additional unsolved crimes, but there was not enough evidence to charge him. Now, more than 2 decades later, Wright has formally admitted to killing Victoria Hall, bringing long-awaited closure to her family and confirming what detectives had feared for years, that she was one of his earliest victims. Prosecutors say Wright's guilty plea definitively closes the cold case, ensuring that Victoria's murder is now officially recognized as part of his criminal history. While Wright will never be released from prison, the admission has been described as a vital moment of truth for investigators and for a family that waited decades for answers. This is not just the end of a cold case, it is the confirmation of a stolen life, a delayed truth, and a reminder of how long justice can take, yet still matter. In the autumn of 1999, a 17-year-old girl set out on a short journey home in Suffolk and never arrived. For more than 2 decades, her disappearance and murder remained one of Britain's most troubling unsolved cases. Now, with a guilty plea from one of the country's most notorious serial killers, the truth has finally been confirmed. Victoria Hall was just 17 years old when she vanished in the early hours of September 19, 1999. She had been out with friends at a nightclub in the Suffolk area. Like many teenagers of the time, she chose to walk part of the way home. It was a route she knew, a decision that in hindsight became fatal. When Victoria failed to return home, her family raised the alarm almost immediately. What followed was a massive police operation. Officers searched roadsides, fields, waterways, and rural tracts. Her disappearance was treated as deeply suspicious from the start, given her age and the suddenness with which she vanished. 5 days later, her body was found in a remote rural location near Trimley St. Martin, close to a quiet country road. The discovery confirmed the worst fears of her family and the wider community. Victoria had been murdered. The brutality of the crime, combined with the lack of immediate leads, shocked Suffolk. Despite extensive inquiries, forensic testing, and public appeals, no suspect could be conclusively linked to her death. The case grew cold, but it was never forgotten. For years, Victoria Hall's name was spoken alongside a painful question: who killed her? At the time, detectives pursued multiple lines of inquiry. They interviewed witnesses, examined vehicles, and followed tips from the public. Her murder predated widespread CCTV coverage, mobile phone tracking, and the advanced DNA techniques that later transformed criminal investigations. What evidence existed was limited, and none of it was strong enough to secure a charge. As the years passed, Victoria's family lived in a state of unresolved grief. There was no trial, no conviction, and no answers. Anniversaries came and went. Media coverage resurfaced periodically, reminding the public that a teenager's killer was still unknown. Then, in 2006, Suffolk was shaken again, this time by a series of murders that would change the course of British criminal history. Between October and December 2006, 5 women were murdered in the Ipswich area. Their bodies were discovered in public locations, dumped and posed in a manner that immediately suggested a serial offender. The investigation that followed was one of the largest murder inquiries in UK history. In December 2006, police arrested Steve Wright, a local man who worked as a lorry driver. In 2008, Wright was convicted of murdering all 5 women and was sentenced to whole life imprisonment, meaning he will never be released. Wright became known in the media as the Suffolk Strangler. Even at the time of his conviction, investigators quietly revisited older unsolved cases. Serial killers rarely begin and end with a single cluster of crimes. Detectives suspected that Wright may have offended before 2006, but suspicion alone is not evidence. Victoria Hall's murder was among the cases reviewed. However, despite similarities in geography and opportunity, there was still not enough forensic proof to formally charge Wright with her killing. Her case remained officially unsolved, even as the man many suspected was responsible spent the rest of his life behind bars. For Victoria's family, that distinction mattered deeply. Wright's imprisonment for other murders did not answer the question of who killed their daughter. Official confirmation matters in law, in history, and in grief. Years later, advances in forensic science, cold case review processes, and renewed investigative scrutiny reopened the file once again. Detectives re-examined evidence, witness statements, and timelines. They looked not only at what was known in 1999, but at what could now be understood with modern techniques and context. Eventually, prosecutors reached a point where the evidential threshold could be met. In a development that stunned the public and quietly devastated those closest to the case, Steve Wright formally pleaded guilty to the murder of Victoria Hall. The admission came while he was already serving his whole life sentence for the Ipswich murders. With that plea, a 25-year-old mystery was finally resolved. The significance of Wright's admission cannot be overstated. It means that Victoria Hall's murder is no longer an unresolved tragedy suspended in uncertainty. It is now a confirmed homicide with a named perpetrator, officially recognized by the justice system. For Victoria's family, the guilty plea brought a form of closure, but not relief. Closure does not undo loss. It does not restore stolen years or erase decades of unanswered questions. What it does provide is truth. Authorities have confirmed that Wright's plea definitively closes the cold case. There will be no trial, no jury, and no further sentencing, because Wright is already serving the maximum possible punishment under UK law. But the admission ensures that Victoria's death is acknowledged as part of his criminal legacy, not as an unresolved footnote. The case has also reignited public discussion about cold cases across the UK. Victoria Hall's murder is a stark reminder that unsolved crimes do not disappear simply because time passes. Families carry them forward, year after year, waiting for answers that may take decades to arrive. It has also highlighted the importance of continued cold case work, even when a suspect is already imprisoned. Justice is not only about punishment, it is about truth, accountability, and recognition of every victim. Victoria Hall was not a statistic. She was a teenager with a family, friends, and a future that ended on a dark roadside in Suffolk in 1999. For years, her name stood for uncertainty. Now it stands for confirmation. The guilty plea by Steve Wright closes one chapter, but it opens another, deeper reckoning about how long justice can take and why it still matters when it finally arrives. This is not a story of resolution in the comforting sense. It is a story of delayed truth. And for a family that waited more than 2 decades, truth, however late, is still essential. In the years following Victoria Hall's murder, the investigation never truly stopped, but it did slow, weighed down by the limits of its time. In 1999, policing operated in a very different technological landscape. CCTV coverage was sparse, mobile phones were not yet ubiquitous, and forensic science had not reached the level of precision that later decades would bring. What detectives had instead was determination, public cooperation, and a growing sense that the answers lay just out of reach. From the beginning, Suffolk police treated Victoria's disappearance as suspicious. She was a teenager who had been seen alive in the early hours after leaving a nightclub, and then vanished along a relatively short route home. Officers reconstructed her last known movements, interviewed friends and witnesses, and appealed repeatedly to the public for information. Roadside searches were conducted along rural routes, and officers examined vehicles known to have traveled through the area at the relevant time. When Victoria's body was discovered days later, the inquiry intensified. Forensic teams worked carefully at the scene, but the location, a quiet country road, offered few obvious clues. Exposure to the elements further complicated evidence recovery. While investigators gathered what they could, there was no immediate breakthrough, no eyewitness who could identify a suspect, and no forensic link strong enough to support an arrest. As weeks turned into months, and months into years, the case entered what police formally classify as a cold case. That designation does not mean abandonment. It means the investigation shifts from active pursuit to periodic review, where evidence is preserved and revisited as new techniques or information become available. Throughout the early 2000s, Victoria Hall's murder was re-examined multiple times. Detectives reviewed files, re-interviewed witnesses, and assessed new tips from the public. Each review raised hope, only for it to recede again. For Victoria's family, The absence of answers became its own form of punishment, an ongoing uncertainty layered on top of grief. Everything changed in late 2006. Between October and December of that year, 5 women were murdered in Ipswich in a series of crimes that shocked the UK. The victims were found in public locations, and the similarities between the cases quickly pointed to a serial offender. The scale of the investigation that followed was unprecedented in the region, drawing national attention and significant resources. When Steve Wright was arrested and later convicted of those murders, detectives began the difficult process of reassessing earlier unsolved cases. This is standard practice in serial murder investigations. Patterns of behavior, geography, and opportunity are analyzed retrospectively to determine whether a convicted offender may be responsible for earlier crimes. Victoria Hall's case was among those reviewed. At first, the link remained circumstantial. Wright lived and worked in the area at the relevant time, and his movements as a lorry driver placed him on Suffolk roads regularly. But suspicion, however strong, is not evidence. Investigators could not retroactively impose guilt without proof that met the legal threshold. For years after Wright's 2008 conviction, Victoria's murder remained unresolved in legal terms. Detectives continued to quietly examine the case, applying advances in forensic science and cold case methodology. DNA analysis improved. Behavioral profiling became more sophisticated. Digital record-keeping allowed investigators to cross-reference data in ways that were not possible in 1999. Crucially, cold case teams are not limited to forensic breakthroughs alone. They also revisit timelines with fresh eyes, reconsider witness statements, and evaluate whether earlier assumptions still hold. Sometimes, progress comes not from new evidence, but from new understanding. Over time, prosecutors and investigators reached a point where the evidential picture had changed. While specific details of the evidence have not been fully disclosed, partly due to the guilty plea and Wright's existing sentence, it became clear that the Crown believed it could now prove the case beyond reasonable doubt. Rather than contest the charge, Wright chose to plead guilty. In the UK justice system, a guilty plea carries significant weight. It removes the need for a trial and constitutes a formal admission of responsibility. In cold cases, such pleas are especially rare and powerful, as they eliminate lingering uncertainty that no amount of circumstantial evidence can fully resolve. For Victoria Hall's family, the plea brought confirmation of what they had lived with for decades, that their daughter's murder was not random, and that the man responsible was now named, officially and unequivocally. Investigators have described the closure of the case as a testament to persistence. Cold cases often take years or decades to resolve, and many never do. That Victoria's case reached a conclusion at all reflects the cumulative effort of multiple generations of officers, forensic specialists, and analysts who refused to let it fade into obscurity. The plea also carries broader implications. It confirms that Steve Wright's crimes did not begin in 2006, but years earlier. This understanding reshapes the historical record, placing Victoria Hall among his victims and altering how his criminal trajectory is understood. From a legal standpoint, Wright's sentence does not change. He is already serving a whole life term, the most severe punishment available in the UK. There is no additional penalty that can be imposed. But justice is not measured only in years added to a sentence. It is also measured in acknowledgement, by naming the crime, naming the victim, and naming the perpetrator. The case has prompted renewed discussion about unsolved murders across the UK. Police forces continue to hold thousands of cold case files, many involving victims whose families are still waiting for answers. Victoria Hall's case demonstrates that time alone does not erase responsibility, and that advances in investigation can still bring resolution long after hope has dimmed. It has also highlighted the importance of funding and resources for cold case units. These teams operate quietly, often with limited public attention, yet their work can change lives decades after crimes occur. For families, a resolved case can mean the difference between endless questions and painful but concrete truth. As the legal chapter of Victoria Hall's case closes, the emotional chapter does not. Closure is a complicated word. It does not suggest peace or acceptance. It suggests an end to uncertainty. For her family, knowing who killed her does not lessen the loss, but it removes the unanswered question that followed them for most of their lives. The significance of this moment lies not in punishment, but in recognition. Victoria Hall's murder is no longer an unresolved tragedy. It is now a confirmed crime, fully acknowledged by the justice system and permanently recorded in history. The road to that acknowledgement took more than 25 years. It passed through technological limits, investigative setbacks, and long stretches of silence. That it ended it all is a reminder that cold cases are not closed by time, but by truth. And sometimes, that truth waits decades to be spoken. As the guilty plea was formally entered, it marked a rare and decisive end to a case that had existed for more than 2 decades in a state of unresolved loss. For the criminal justice system, the admission by Steve Wright did not change his sentence, but it fundamentally changed the status of one young victim whose name had long been associated with uncertainty rather than accountability. Victoria Hall was no longer the center of a mystery. She was now officially recognized as one of his victims. In practical terms, the plea brought the investigative process to a close. There would be no contested trial, no jury deliberation, and no need for prosecutors to lay out evidence in open court. That absence of a trial, however, does not diminish the significance of the outcome. In cold cases, a guilty plea is often the most definitive form of resolution possible. It removes doubt not only legally, but historically. For detectives who had worked on the case across different eras, the plea was a confirmation that their persistence had not been in vain. Cold case investigations are often passed from one team to another, sometimes across generations of officers. The individuals who first searched for Victoria in 1999 were not the same ones reviewing files decades later. Yet the case endured, preserved through careful record-keeping and a shared understanding that unresolved murders still demand answers. The admission also reshaped how Wright's criminal history is understood. When he was convicted in 2008 for the Ipswich murders, his crimes appeared concentrated within a short period. The confirmation that he killed Victoria Hall in 1999 establishes a much longer offending timeline. This matters not only for historical accuracy, but for how criminologists and investigators understand patterns of escalation and behavior in serial offenders. Experts have long noted that serial killers rarely begin with multiple murders in quick succession. There is often a progression, earlier offenses that go undetected or unlinked at the time. Victoria's case now fits that pattern, illustrating how a crime committed years earlier can remain isolated until later developments bring clarity. For Victoria's family, the plea did not reopen the case. It closed a door that had been left ajar for most of their lives. Families of cold case victims often describe living with 2 parallel realities: the knowledge that their loved one is gone and the absence of an answer as to who was responsible. The guilty plea resolved one of those realities, but not the other. Public reaction to the confirmation was marked by a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that the truth was finally acknowledged. Sorrow that it took more than 25 years for that truth to be formally recognized. Media coverage across the UK reflected that balance, focusing less on Wright himself and more on the significance of closure for a family that had waited decades. Authorities were careful in their statements, emphasizing facts rather than emotion. They confirmed the plea, reaffirmed that Wright remains imprisoned for life, and acknowledged the impact on Victoria's family. The tone was deliberate. In cases involving long-delayed justice, restraint matters. It signals respect for victims and avoids turning resolution into spectacle. The case has also prompted renewed attention to how cold cases are prioritized. Police forces across the UK maintain extensive archives of unsolved crimes, many dating back decades. Advances in forensic science, data analysis, and investigative techniques mean that cases once thought insoluble can now be revisited with fresh tools. However, cold case work is resource-intensive. It requires time, funding, and specialized expertise. Victoria Hall's case stands as an example of what sustained commitment can achieve. But it also raises difficult questions about how many other families are still waiting for similar answers. Another important aspect of the plea is what it represents for historical record. Unsolved murders often occupy an ambiguous place in public memory. They are remembered as tragedies, but without resolution, they lack accountability. With Wright's admission, Victoria's case moves from the category of unsolved to solved, altering how it is documented, taught, and understood. This matters not only for her family, but for the integrity of the justice system. A system that acknowledges its past, even belatedly, demonstrates that time does not erase responsibility. The plea reinforces the principle that offenders remain accountable for all their crimes, even those committed decades earlier. The emotional weight of delayed justice is complex. Some families describe closure as a misleading term, suggesting a neat ending that does not exist. What the plea provides is not closure in an emotional sense, but resolution in a factual one. It ends speculation. It ends the question of who. It allows remembrance to be anchored in truth rather than uncertainty. From a legal perspective, the outcome also highlights the role of guilty pleas in the UK system. By pleading guilty, Wright accepted responsibility without forcing the family through a trial that would have revisited traumatic details. In that sense, the plea spared them an additional burden, even as it confirmed the worst possible truth. The absence of a trial means that some details may never be fully aired in public. That can be frustrating for those seeking a complete narrative. But the justice system is not obligated to satisfy curiosity. Its role is to establish responsibility and ensure accountability within the bounds of law. Victoria Hall's case has now entered a different phase, one of remembrance rather than investigation. Her name is no longer associated with an unanswered question, but with a confirmed crime and a known perpetrator. That shift matters deeply to families, communities, and the historical record. It also serves as a reminder of the human cost of unresolved crime. For more than 25 years, Victoria's family lived without answers. Their experience reflects that of countless others whose lives are shaped not only by loss, but by uncertainty. The resolution of one case does not lessen the pain of others, but it demonstrates that answers can still emerge, even after decades. The confirmation has also led to renewed reflection on how society remembers victims. Media narratives often focus on perpetrators, particularly those labeled as serial killers. Yet cases like this underline the importance of centering victims, recognizing their lives, their families, and the impact of their loss. As time passes, the facts of Victoria Hall's case will be absorbed into history. What remains is the lesson that cold cases are not static. They evolve as evidence, technology, and circumstances change. They require patience, persistence, and a willingness to revisit the past with care. The guilty plea by Steve Wright does not rewrite history, but it completes a chapter that had remained unfinished for far too long. It confirms that Victoria Hall's murder was not an anomaly, not a mystery destined to fade, but a crime for which responsibility has finally been acknowledged. In that acknowledgement lies the true significance of this moment, not in punishment, which was already imposed, but in truth, which was delayed, but not denied. The confirmation of guilt in the murder of Victoria Hall has carried a weight that goes far beyond one courtroom admission. It has altered the emotional landscape for a family that lived with uncertainty for more than 25 years, and it has reshaped how the UK understands one of its most notorious serial killers. When Steve Wright pleaded guilty, the justice system did not deliver something new so much as it restored something that had been missing: certainty. For families of cold case victims, certainty is not a small thing. It does not erase grief, but it ends the exhausting loop of unanswered questions. For decades, Victoria's family carried two realities at once: the knowledge that their daughter had been murdered and the absence of an official answer as to who was responsible. The guilty plea collapsed those two realities into one undeniable truth. From that moment on, Victoria's story stopped being an open case and became a resolved one, anchored in law rather than speculation. This matters because unresolved cases live differently in public memory. They linger as suspicions, rumors, and half-understood narratives. Resolution changes how a victim is remembered. It allows their name to be spoken without a question mark attached. It allows history to be written with accuracy rather than guesswork. And it ensures that the responsibility for the crime is formally recorded, not inferred. The plea also clarifies the full scope of Wright's offending. When he was sentenced to whole life imprisonment in 2008 for the Ipswich murders, the public understanding of his crimes was framed around a short, intense period. The admission in Victoria Hall's case establishes a longer trajectory, confirming that his capacity for violence existed years earlier than previously proven. This is not merely a detail for criminologists. It changes how the past is understood and how future investigations into serial offending are approached. Cold case specialists have long argued that many serial offenders begin years before they are caught. Early crimes often remain isolated because evidence is limited, patterns are not yet visible, and technology cannot yet connect the dots. Victoria's case exemplifies this reality. In 1999, investigators worked with the tools available to them. They searched tirelessly, appealed to the public, and preserved evidence as best they could. What they lacked was not commitment, but the means to conclusively identify the killer. The decades that followed brought those means. Advances in forensic science, data comparison, and investigative review changed what was possible. Cold case teams revisited old evidence with new eyes, applying techniques that did not exist at the time of the crime. This cumulative progress, paired with Wright's own admission, ultimately allowed the case to be closed. The lesson is sobering and hopeful at the same time. Sobering because justice took so long, hopeful because time did not erase accountability. The impact of the plea has extended beyond Suffolk. Across the UK, families of unsolved murder victims have watched this case closely. For some, it has renewed hope that answers may still come. For others, it has reinforced the importance of preserving evidence and maintaining cold case resources, even when years pass without progress. Each resolved case sends a signal that unresolved ones still matter. Police forces have echoed that message. Cold case units operate quietly, often without the urgency or visibility of active investigations, but their work can be transformative. Victoria Hall's case demonstrates why sustained investment in these units is not optional. It is an ethical commitment to victims and families who were left behind by circumstances rather than by indifference. The justice system's response has also been measured. Because Wright is already serving a whole life sentence, there was no dramatic courtroom confrontation, no new punishment to announce. The significance lay in the acknowledgement itself. Authorities were careful to center the victim rather than the perpetrator, recognizing that public attention often gravitates toward notorious names at the expense of those harmed. That restraint is important. Serial killers are often mythologized in media coverage, their identities repeated until they overshadow their victims. The confirmation in Victoria's case invites a different emphasis on remembrance, on the cost of delay, and on the quiet perseverance that eventually brought truth to light. For Victoria's family, the path forward remains complex. Closure is not an ending. It is a change in how grief is carried. The knowledge of who said, "I did this," does not soften the loss of a daughter, sister, or friend. But it does allow mourning to exist without uncertainty. It replaces the question of who with the certainty of this is what happened, a certainty that many families never receive. The wider public conversation has reflected that nuance. There has been relief that the case is solved, alongside frustration that it took so long. Both reactions are valid. They speak to the reality that justice systems are human institutions, bound by the limits of evidence and technology at any given moment, yet capable of growth over time. Victoria Hall's case now stands as a reference point in discussions about cold case policy, forensic investment, and victim recognition. It illustrates why files should never be closed simply because years have passed, and why admissions, even late ones, carry real value. They correct the record. They honor the victim. They affirm that truth, however delayed, is still truth. As this chapter closes, the story shifts from investigation to legacy. Victoria's name is no longer attached to an unsolved mystery. It is attached to a resolved crime and a hard-won acknowledgement. Her life, brief as it was, is no longer overshadowed by uncertainty. For the justice system, the case reinforces a principle that should never fade.